Hi. Okay, so we're going to get going. We just did a back-to-back workshop in the International 2. And we ran out of time. So we're going to cut essentially the first part of the presentation, which relate to the evolution of the IBIS 3D system. So just to get going, the workshop essentially is designed for IBIS operator. So if you're a manager and you didn't get training in the IBIS system, we're going to get extremely technical with the actual process of the correlation examinations and the sorting and the phasing of how you would go about doing a correlation examinations. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Wayne Orenzi. I'm the section head of the Physical Sciences section in Toronto, Ontario in Canada. I'm also the National Quality Assurance Manager of the Cyber User Group. You heard Yves speak today about the structure of the Cyber User Group. We have 7 sites in Canada. In 2011, we got our first municipal police agency that acquired a IBIS system. So that's exciting for us. Another big project that we're working on now is the NIBIN-CYBIN. NIBIN being our counterparts in the United States. We have installed international servers in both countries, and we in the process of running a pilot project essentially to do cross-border correlation examinations. So I'm going to hand over to Michelle just to introduce herself, and then we'll get going.
All right, so my name is Michelle, and I'm a forensic technologist at CFS. So we kind of have a different setup in our lab. We have the technologists who work solely on IBIS. We're the ones who do all the correlations, and we give the possible hits to our scientists who work and do all the manual comparisons on the microscope. So we are very separated and focused groups on different things. The techs are the IBIS domain, and the scientists do the microscopic work.
So just by way of introduction, we're probably going to skip about 6 or 7 slides and a video as well, because myself and Michelle discussed this earlier, and our concern was that the LICR system, which is LICR, which is the logic interpretation of correlation results, essentially is the key component of this workshop, and we don't want you guys to miss that, and the video is 12 minutes long. So I'm going to skip essentially the evolution of IBIS. I'm just going to go through this is a workshop. Essentially, we hope that it's going to be interactive. If we wanted to do a presentation, we could have done that in the morning session. So for those IBIS operators, if you have any technical questions, now's the time to ask. The video, essentially, the presentation with all the supporting materials, including flowcharts, would be included in the IFFS CD that will be made available. And we'll also leave our cards if you want to contact us after. So the idea was essentially, can you just go back to there we go. So the idea is essentially to broaden our knowledge with Matchpoint Plus. There's a video that's on YouTube that FTI essentially distributed about 3 years ago, and that essentially gives you an idea about what the capabilities of IBIS and what it does. So in a nutshell, it's a screening tool essentially that captures digital images. It uses an algorithm and essentially gives you a top 20. Fairly straightforward. And that's what I thought. I knew when I started in 1996 in the South African Police Service, and I was introduced to IBIS in Cape Town for the first time, that I have a good understanding about what the heritage system is about. And then for FTI, it's about quality of images that's acquired onto the system. You'll hear about the delimiters, you'll hear about anchor lines. It's about the quality of the images that's uploaded, because the philosophy is that if you put good quality images into the system, then essentially that is what you're going to get out. For me, as an operational manager working at the Center of Forensic Sciences, it's about timing, turnaround time. That's all the client wants. I don't care about quality. I don't care about ISO. All I'm worried about is that how quick can you get my evidence back to me with a report. So we are, with the liquor system that we came up with, hopefully trying to be thorough with our correlation examinations, but also do it in a timely manner. And then the application of the logical interpretation of correlation results. So we got our 3D system back in 2012, last year, September, and the technologists, the 5 technologists, did a validation study and a performance verification check. And they came to me and said, we are now going to change our average turnaround time from 2 days to essentially about 5 days, because it takes a significant amount of time to do correlation examinations. And I was surprised. I'm like, what do you mean? And when I looked at the training guide for match point, it says that the correlation results gives you 5 independent scores. And what we know as operators, there's the max phase, you look at your top 20, and that's it, right? What they don't consider is the fact that we have 2-dimensional images on the system, so the backward compatibility. FTI is telling us that we have to look at each and every score, which is a concern because my top 20 now becomes my top 100. 5 independent categories that I can look at, so I'm looking at 100 images and no longer the top 20. So myself and Michelle had some dialogue, and I had to go back to when I was introduced to the system. So she's telling me about the max Lee and the max phase. I'm like, Michelle, what happened to the max phase? The best bullet-to-bullet score. No matter what the system gives you, for me, the fundamental premise of the correlation results is your max phase, which is your best bullet-to-bullet score. I don't care about all the other scores, because the other scores essentially is used to calculate your max phase, unless it's a damaged bullet. So with that said, that's essentially what we would, some background information, and we're going to skip a few slides because we're going to run out of time. And Michelle is going to speak about best practices and things that we discovered when we went through the validation study and the performance verification study. And then she's going to take us through the phasing and the sorting, and then the application of liquor. She's going to do a brief introduction to all the videos and summarize it at the end. Please feel free, if you have any questions at that point in time, that we can have that discussion. Okay, I'll hand over to you.
All right. So switching from heritage to tracks, I think as users we found that there's some things that are really great and other things that we need to adjust for. So one of the things that we all know is, of course, if you have a firearm shooting ammunition components, that there is variance between, test fire 1 and test fire 2, test fire 1 and test fire 10, and sometimes that variance in the markings that you see has to do with the metal composition. So on the screen, what you actually see is a cartridge case hit. If you're going through your correlation results, you might actually think these two are not linked to each other, because on first glance you can see that they actually look quite different. If you click to the next image, then you'll see side by side that there is similarity there, and these two are actually hit, even if the firing pins are very different sizes. And so seeing that as a user, I might think, maybe if I'm going through my results quickly, I might jump past it and say, oh, they don't look at all like, I might miss a hit. But what I found that's really useful with tracks is if you go to the next image, you can actually see now full head stamps. And full head stamps are great because as users, we can now see what's my item, what's their item, and are they the same brand? If they are the same brand, I suspect that they're more likely the same type of metal composition. Then I'm maybe a bit more conservative on whether or not they should look more similar. But if they are different head stamps, they're different brands, I might think, you know what, I need to be more open-minded. Maybe this is something I need to look at more closely, put them side by side, examine it further, because there might be something there. They just at first glance look different. So I think that's another cool tool of tracks and something we can take advantage of as users. Next slide. Something that's very important is anchor lines. So anchor lines, there's some things that are the same between tracks and heritage, and some things that are different. Same things are that the anchor lines are still used as your angle of your striations. So whatever you set your anchor lines at, that's how they straighten the striations to create that digital signature for comparison. So that's very important. If you put your angles off, your striations won't be straightened properly for the correlations. So that's one thing. The other things anchor lines does, obviously, is it defines the region of interest, which is your land engraved areas, so your lees. The other thing the anchor lines do is define your lee width. So the distance from the top to the bottom anchor line, that's how big the lee is. So those are things that are the same between the two systems. But now that you've got tracks, if you have a 2D bullet database, you got to worry about another component, and that's backward compatibility. Next slide. Yeah. Next slide, please. No, it's not. So what you need to know between tracks and heritage is about a 10% lee width cutoff. So you might have noticed now if you've moved to tracks, when you're doing your bullet correlations, let's say your item is 0.100 inches, you might see something that comes up that's 0.020. And you're like, what's something so small coming up? Well, the reason is, in the past with 2D correlations, in heritage, they had a 10% lee width cutoff. If it's more than 10% too big or more than 10% too small, it just didn't come up in your results because they didn't correlate it. It just got cut off and it wouldn't get correlated against your items. So you only saw something in a certain range of sizes. What happened was when they moved to tracks, they got rid of that cutoff. So even though yours might be really big, something really small lee width size will still come up in your results. So there is a difference now between those two. When you're doing tracks to tracks, you'll still have different lee widths. When you're doing heritage items, or if you're doing a 2D correlation category,
I'll now go to my multi-viewer
screen.
screen.
That 10% cutoff. So you need to be aware of that. And the next thing is something called the predefined translation range for the best alignment. And that's something that you might not have heard of, and we have a video to kind of explain that. I think I have to bring the microphone over.
Yes, we have some technical difficulties between the PC and a Matchpoint Plus.
Do you know what the predefined translation range is for best alignment and how that can affect your bullet correlations? What it refers to is when your bullets are being correlated against each other, what happens is that the lees in each bullet are being compared to each other. And when they're doing that comparison, your test lee will be compared to your reference lee, but it can only translate, basically move up and down in comparison to your reference lee in a predefined pixel range. And that range is a secret. It is proprietary to FTI. What it basically means is your test lee can only move up and down in a certain amount that's set by FTI and within the algorithm to compare and get the best alignment possible with your reference lee. So what can happen is if someone sets bad anchor lines in a bullet, when it's compared to your reference item, the possible alignment that is the best might fall outside that translation range that is set. And so what will happen is you might not get a high score, and it might not come up as possible in your top 20, even though it might actually be a hit. Because of poor anchor line placement, the best alignment might fall outside that translation range. And so without the best alignment, the score might be low, and so it might not show up in the top 20. This predefined translation range for the best alignment of your lead to lees is a lot smaller for 2D images, but for 3D images like what you see on screen, it is a bigger translation range. Again, we don't know what that number is. So you need to be very careful when you're setting your anchor lines, keeping in mind that if your anchor lines are a little off, then possibly your lees, when being compared to another item's lees, though they might have the best alignment because it might be a hit, they might not be correlated for that best alignment and bring up high scores because possibly the best alignment falls outside of the predefined translation.
Okay. So I hope that makes sense. So what you need to keep in mind now is that if you're doing bullets and you're doing 2D to 3D or 3D to 2D, now there's this additional thing that the anchor lines do that you have to worry about. I think in the past with Heritage, we found it easy to do anchor lines because you had those beautiful red lasers, and when they came down, you could see where they bent, and you're like, that's where the anchor line is. And before as well, you set the anchor lines for each lead as you were requiring it. You can move up and down the bullet, look for slippage, all that stuff, and see where the shoulder was before you place your anchor line. Now with tracks, it just does the whole circumference of your bullet, and then at the end, you get a static image, and you got to decide from that picture, basically, where do I put my anchor lines? And the anchor lines is so much more sensitive now because you got such high resolution that with that high power magnification, it's even a little harder because you're seeing so many striations, like where is my shoulder? So this is an issue that I think is unfortunately somewhat of a limitation of the new system. But with HD 3D, as you can see, they have that shape now that you can see the topography, you can see the side of your bullet, and that will really help you to be able to tell where to put the anchor lines. But in the meantime, you might have missed bullet hits just because the best alignment that is possible for your bullets might actually fall outside that translation range that they've set. So between 3D going back to 2D, you might have problems there. So the only thing you can do is just try to do your best with anchor line placement, and then maybe we'll just have to hope for the best. Next slide. So the next thing is bullet phasing. I think most of us recognize this photo from probably training. This comes from the match point training book. So as we know, depending on how many leads you have how many phases, and the scores are calculated on the, basically there's a score for each lead to lead comparison. So if I have 4 lead to 4 leads, there's 4 times 4, there's 16 possible lead to lead comparisons. And depending on those scores, they generate max lead, peak phase, max phase, and so on. So, okay, click. So what you might not know that we discovered when we were doing correlations for bullets is that it doesn't depend on what you're actually correlating for. We assumed when we opened something up in side-by-side, and I'm correlating max phase 3D, let's say, I assumed that when they came up side-by-side, that was the phase that had that high score. But that was actually a wrong assumption. When they come up in side-by-side, it's based on default phase setting, and you can click. It's based on default phase setting and not what you're correlating for. So just because you're correlating max phase 3D and you bring up your 2 bullets side by side, that doesn't mean that in that phase setting that was the one that generated the high score. Instead, it's just a default. So if you want to look at exactly the phase setting that generated the high score, that caused that item to come up in your top 20, you have to manually do that yourself. Because what we're doing here in CFS is we use IBIS as a screening tool. For us, it's not like a scientist sitting down with 2 items and saying, I'm going to look at all the possible phase settings to do an identification. We're using IBIS for time saving, for efficiency, for all those things. And we want to just look at what it is. We want to look at items that came up in our top 20 because the IBIS said it was good. And so I want to look at it in the phase setting that created that good score. And so for us, it's very important to see exactly in the setting that generated the score. And because IBIS doesn't give that to you naturally, you have to adjust for it yourself. And we have another video.
Here I want to show you that there's actually something you may not know about IBIS, and Matchpoint Plus in particular. For correlations, when you're doing bullets, there's actually something you need to consider called phasing. For example, if I'm looking at this item here, and I decided I want to look at the results, we know that there are 5 correlation categories, which you can select in the multiviewer from the drop down here. And looking at it, you can see that you can choose one of these 5 correlation categories and look at their results. Now if I chose max phase 3D, and let's say I want to look at this item side by side, now this isn't a good example. In this one, we are still looking at max phase 3D, which we are told is phase 3, whereas max leaf 3D is phase 4. Now what do we see on the left? The default given to us is Li 2 to Li 5, which would be Li 1 to Li 4. So this is actually phase 4 that we're seeing. But remember, we selected max phase 3D to be correlating, and yet we're given phase 4. This demonstrates that phasing is not actually dependent on which correlation category you're choosing. It's actually dependent on a default setting. So be aware when you're correlating for bullets that you might need to adjust for phasing, depending on the category that you're correlating for. There are 3 default settings. There's max phase 2D when you're comparing two 2D items. When you're comparing tracks items, the default that you'll see is max Lie 3D. And if you're doing a fragment of unknown number of Lies, there is actually no default phase setting that your results will come up in. It will just be random, in which case you will need to check the percent sign each time to adjust properly.
Is there any questions on default phasing and why that's important, or how we do that? Yes? I'm not actually sure. I think when we first found out, it was just accidentally that we found out. I was talking to Mike about correlations, and we were just doing something on screen. He remotely connected, and I was like, okay, so now I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at this, and he's like, oh, no, they're actually not the same phase. And that's when I realized accidentally that there was this issue. I don't know if it's something that's going to be fixed. I don't know if it's been fixed in HD 3D. I think it's important to us as end users. I don't know if everyone else agrees or not, but if people are comfortable doing it like they would do a manual comparison, which is look at all the phases, then I guess it doesn't matter. But that's not the way we do correlations. We only look at the one phase that brought the highest score. So for us, it's very important. I feel like if there's enough users that think it's an issue and they want it to come up in exactly the right phase that generate the score, then I think they'll probably correct it because they're very client-oriented. But if there isn't enough people even aware of the issue, or it really doesn't matter to them because they're going to go ahead and do a full comparison, looking at, changing all the phase settings and doing all that, then I guess there's no motive for them to change it. So I think it'll depend on the response from users. Any other questions? Okay, then we're going to move on. Hopefully it makes sense. You can still stop us if you want to, because we're going to be building on this as we go along. This is almost just like the cornerstone of the next step. So if you're getting a little lost here, it's definitely jump in. Otherwise, you're going to get super, super lost later on. Okay, so here's an example of how you do adjust. Now that you know that the phasing is a default phasing, so 2D to 2D, it doesn't matter if you acquired it in tracks. If you're doing a 2D correlation category, if it comes up 2D visual to 2D visual, it's going to be max phase 2D. That's the default. If it comes up tracks to tracks, that's the 3D images to 3D image, it's going to be max Lie 3D. That's a default. And if you, the one that default setting that trumps them all, if you have a fragment and you don't know how many Lies there are, because let's say you have a jacket and it's just got one Lie on it, there is just random phasing, random. It could be one moment it'll be max phase 3D phase setting, one moment will be max Lie 3D phase setting. So you just got to check each time and adjust. So I'm going to show you a video here of an example of how you adjust the phasing to make sure you're looking at the right thing.
So as I said before, this is a tracks item to tracks item, 3D to 3D, so the default phase setting should be max Lie 3D, and that's phase 2. And that's what you see here on the left in the mosaic, Lie 1 to Lie 2. So that's fine. But let's say I wanted to actually correlate this for max phase 3D, and I want to see it in phase 3. Then you go ahead, close that window, and you need to move manually your test bullet, so it's Lie 1 to Lie 3, and then this would be phase 3. Then to correlate, you just need to look at each of these pairs, keeping them in phase 3. So you move along here to the right and do your pairs that way. Now, what are the other categories you might want to correlate it for? How about max phase 2D? That's phase 5. So again, remember, we always refer our phasing to the Lie 1 of your reference bullet, and then you move the test bullet into the correct phase. So that would be Lie 1 to Lie 5, look at that pair. Then you would look at Lie 2 to Lie 1, look at that pair. and then so on until you finish all of the pairs in that phase. The tricky ones are if you want to correlate for max Lie. Peak phase, by definition, is just the best Lie to Lie combination in max phase, so of course it will be phase 5. But max Lie 2D is just the best Lie to Lie combination in all the possible Lie to Lie combinations, so it could be theoretically any phase. At this point, comparing these scores between max Lie and peak phase, we can tell that they're not the same Lie to Lie comparison. All that tells us is that max Lie, whatever phase that was not phase 5, because otherwise we would expect max Lie and peak phase to have the same score. Because peak phase is the best Lie to Lie combination in max phase, then if that phase had the highest Lie to Lie combination overall, we should see max Lie also having a score of 176. Different scores between max Lie and peak phase 2D just tells us that the max Lie phase is any phase but the same phase as max phase 2D. So what would I do if I wanted to correlate for max Lie 2D? At this point, all I can say is it's not phase 5. So if you want to see the combination or the phase setting that brought the high score, all you can do is go through all the possible phase combinations without looking at phase 5. So what I would do is, just to remember where I am, I would start off at Lie 1, of course, and do phase 1. After lining up for phase 1, looking at all the combinations for that, I would then go ahead and look at phase 2. And then you look at that pair and the next pair and all the way through, all the 5 pairs. Then it's time to look at Lie 3. And that would be phase 3, look at all those pairs. Then look at phase 4 and look at all those pairs. And that would be how you would manage to look at max Lie and make sure you don't miss what the computer saw when you don't actually know the actual specific phase. It is a lot more work when you don't know the phase for max Lie 2D, but by doing this, all the possible phase combinations, you are making sure that you don't miss a possible hit.
So any questions on how to adjust for phasing there? Okay, so if you click the % sign on your side-by-side screen, it will show up that little box that shows the different phases. And so it tells you the phase for max phase 3D, max phase 2D, max Lie 3D, but that's it. So you don't know phase setting for 2 categories, peak phase 2D and max Lie 2D. But peak phase 2D, by definition, is just the best Lie to Lie within max phase. So of course, it's the same phase setting. So basically, you know that. The problem is the max Lie 2D. We don't know the phase. They don't give you the phase for that. It's not recorded by FTI. So if you're correlating for that category, you kind of just got to do some mental math, I guess, to try to figure it out. So what we're doing in that example is we're assuming if max Lie is just the best Lie to Lie in any possible combination. So if I'm doing back to my example of 4 Lies to 4 Lies, there's 16 possible Lie to Lies. So out of the 16 possibilities, what's the best score? That's max Lie. Now peak phase is the best Lie to Lie inside max phase. So if my peak phase is score 100, and I see that my max Lie is score 100, I'm assuming max Lie is the same. It just so happens that the best Lie to Lie in all the Lies is the same best Lie to Lie inside the max phase. So knowing that, then I assume it's the same phase as max phase 2D. If they are different scores, then you kind of just say it's not that phase, and you do all the other combinations. That makes sense? We're on the same page here? Yes? Okay. We'll move on then. This one is basically just a slide to say, you know what, there's limitations to the system. I think we've tried to adjust for some of them. So looking at head stamps, adjusting phasing, being aware of anchor lines. Now the next thing is why we still why we still having missed hits when we're doing all these things and doing our best. Well, some things just remain limitations. You can't unfortunately do something about them. Things that can still cause missed hits are such things as pixelation. So here you can see different magnifications. They are a bullet hit here, but at that pixel level, there are differences. And that can affect your signatures, and the correlation algorithm runs on the signature, so there's differences. The next one is delimiter placement. Again, this is an example from before that was a cartridge case hit. You can see at the middle, at the very base of it, at the very center of it, that footprint, it is the same. You can see that there's similarity there, but there is a very big difference in sizes of firing pins. And that's going to play effect into your correlation algorithms as well. From so much data in the signature to nothing almost in the signature, it might miss. And the last one is lighting and reflection. This one's not as bad of a problem now that we have tracks, because the lighting is so automated that it's not dependent on the user's eyes. One person likes it dark, one person likes it bright. So this one's not as much of a problem, but sometimes it's still an issue of reflection. If you have an item that has all this lacquer on it, you best clean it with acetone, because otherwise that's not going to reflect properly and you might have missed it. So we're moving on into our main topic. So as we said before, when we switched from heritage to tracks, we went from correlating one top 20 max phase 2D to 5 categories recommended by FTI. So it became 20 to theoretically 100 items to correlate. Realistically, that 100 was really about 80, maybe 60 if you're lucky, because there was overlap of items between the 5 categories. But we found that was taking way too much time. We actually ran the full correlation procedure, doing the top 20 for 5 categories for almost a month, I think, adjusting for phasing as we showed on those previous videos. So adjusting with phasing, doing the 5 categories, we went from correlating one bullet around half an hour to maybe 2 hours if you were really unlucky for one bullet. So our turnaround time just was plummeted, because heritage, you had RDAS, you had match point, you had 2 systems to look at results. Then when you switched over to tracks, which is very modular, each one has their own station, you can only look at results in match point plus, and we only have one match point plus. So from 2 systems to 1, plus 5 categories instead of 1, so it skyrocketed our time. So after running the full correlation procedure, using the adjusting for phasing, we have, if you insist on doing the 5 categories, that's fine. If you have the time for that, we actually have a flow chart which will be in the DVD as well. So if you want to look at that, that will help you to adjust for phasing while doing the 5 correlation categories. But we moved from 5 into our Licker system. So our logical interpretation of correlation results, Licker, we moved into that when we realized it's just operationally wasn't feasible for us to do top 20 for 5 categories. It was just too much for us to do. So our basic foundation behind Licker is a whole bullet to whole bullet comparison. When you're looking at whole bullets to whole bullets, if they are a hit, you expect that there will be similarity around the whole bullet. It won't just be one Lee that's great. It should be the whole bullet that there's similarities. So for that reason, we went to looking at max phase as our most important correlation category. And that's why we're doing max phase 2D for our 2D database, and we're doing max phase 3D for the 3D components. The reason we went from 5 to 3, though, we're still doing one extra category, and that's max Lee 2D. So we realize whole bullets to whole bullets is the way to go, but we want to accommodate for fragments. So much of our evidence is damaged, and we get fragments. So we don't want to lose those that might be hits. So the way we do that is how it's, again, we have to understand how the algorithm works. So max phase is just the summation of all the lead to leads in that pair, in that phase. So for example, I have a 4 lead bullet, and you have a 4 lead bullet. Between our bullets, we do comparison. Let's say there's 4 lead pairs. Each pair, let's say, had a score of 100. Let's say 100's an average score. It's not a hit, it's not great, but let's say all of them scored 100. So 100 times 4, there's 100, 100, 100, 100. You sum that up, that's your max phase. You got a score of 400. Not bad, it's kind of good, I guess. Now you got, let's say you have a fragment. Let's say your evidence item has 1 Lee, and it's a hit, but it's only got 1 Lee. So let's say it generates a super high score. Instead of 100, it has a score of 200, right? But now, if max phase is a summation, 200 plus 0 is 200. So that means your max phase score is 200. So my hit item, 200. My not so great bullet, but full bullet, 400. 200, the fragment, it's not going to come up in your results. So that's why it's an issue for us. Max phase 3D though, the 3D component, it doesn't do summation anymore. It's actually now an average. So 400 divided by 4, score is still 100, which is not great. Now my fragment, which is score 200 divided by 1, it's a score of 200. So now 200 to 100, my fragment's going to pop up in my top 20. So that's why we're doing max phase 3D, max phase 2D, and max Lie 2D. Because max Lie 2D is the summation, max phase 3D does averages. So we don't need to accommodate fragments for the 3D, but we need to accommodate fragments in the 2D. Any questions on that? Make sense? Okay. So that's how we came across Liquor. So we're doing max phase 3D, max phase 2D, and if there's damaged bullets, we're going to do max Lie 2D. So if my item's pristine, I'm only looking at the damaged bullets of fragments that come up in my top 20 for max Lie 2D. If my item's a fragment, then I look at all 20 that come up in max Lie 2D. Okay. So there's going to be a quick video here. So we've come up with 2 methods of how to apply Liquor into correlations, and we're going to show that how that's done. There are kind of like 2 methods to do it that we've come up with. So you'll see the decision point of when to choose one method versus when to choose the other method, and then we'll just show the method that we tend to use the most because it's basically the one that applies in all situations. Okay.
Now that you've been introduced to the Liquor system, let me show you how a bullet correlation is done, applying that system. So for example, let's say I want to correlate this 9mm Luger bullet. Go ahead, go to correlation results filtering, and order your chart by max phase 3D from high to low scores. We'll start clicking off our top 20, looking out for items that might not be casework, so such as training, QA items, so on, and those ones you won't include. And just remember how many of those items there are that you'll need to add on and check off after this 20 of this page. So looking down this list, I don't see anything that looks like it's not casework, so that's a top 20 there. I'll check my last item's score, 160. Check the next item, and we do have another 160, so I'll include that because it could have been in my top 20 if it wasn't for the way they order these lists. And that is my top 20. At this point, there is a divergence, possible options. There are many ways, of course, to do correlations applying the Liquor system. It will depend on the users, their preferences, what they're comfortable with, what buttons they like to press, how they want to work. But basically, I've come up with 2 final methods, one called the chart method, one called the multi-viewer method. And I think they are good methods because they're very efficient and they, as much as possible, minimize mouse clicking and doing unnecessary work based on the way you correlate and the order that the methods work in. So after I've clicked off my top 20 for max phase 3D, I find this is a decision point between doing what I call the chart method and what I call the multi-viewer method. If I go ahead now and still have my top 20 clicked, but now organize this chart by max phase 2D, I can see I only have one item that crosses over into the top 20 from max phase 3D into max phase 2D. If I do the same now to organize by max Lie 2D, I see there's 2 items that cross over from max phase 3D to max Lie 2D. Because there's not a lot of overlap, and I'm guessing these items are likely going to have different phase settings for the different correlation categories, I feel like it's okay to do these correlations separately and use what I call the chart method, doing max phase 3D separate from max phase 2D and then separate from max Lie 2D. I like using this method because it helps me remember where I am in correlations, and also because if I need to stop, it's very easy to find my place where I've left off. If I had seen a lot of overlap between these categories, I would probably choose then the multi-viewer method. The thing of the multi-viewer method is you will not be doing redundant work because you will not look at an item more than once for the same phase setting, but it does mean that it is a little harder to pick up if you have to stop somewhere and go back and
So due to some technical difficulties, Wayne's going to have to switch now to this laptop to show the last video. But just to recap then, basically what happens is you start doing your correlation, and if there is a lot of overlap, then I would choose to do the multi-viewer method. At this point, in the time that we've been doing correlation, so last few months, I haven't seen a lot of overlap between 3D correlation categories and 2D correlation categories. So generally speaking, I always just use the chart method because I find that's more useful and more efficient. But the multi-viewer method is a possibility if you do see a lot of overlap. I just want to remind everyone that we're going to watch the video. It is kind of technical. I know that there's a lot of stuff that might be new to you guys. So you might need to watch it a few times and so on. So this videos and the flowcharts that we have created as well, which are kind of like cheat sheets to show you like click this now, click this now, click this now. That will all be given to FTI, so I think it will all be on the DVD. So if you need to rewatch it or whatever, you can do that. At the end as well, you can always leave your business card with us, or I can give you mine, and then we can also connect that way if you need to. So this one will just be a video of the chart method, because the multi-viewer method I only came up with like 2 weeks ago, so I don't actually have a flowchart or a video or anything like that. I probably will do a flowchart soon, but the video may or may not happen depending on operational needs. But meanwhile, we'll just play the chart method, and this one should be good for most situations.
I'll now go to my multi-viewer screen. And here what you can do is look at your bullet that you acquired, see what is the least size that's representative of your bullet. So about 0.101 for my bullet is about the range I'm getting. And then look at the test bullets that came up in your top 20. Here you can actually get rid of possibly quite a few items just based on class characteristics alone. So on the first item, I see a 0.079 lead width size, and that's significantly smaller, more than 10%. And since I can see that these shoulders look pretty good, and it's not a damaged item, I feel confident that I can say I don't need to look at it further because of class characteristics. Keep going along the items. This one's 0.048, significantly smaller, and this one looks like a pretty good shoulder, so it's probably a pretty accurate size, and so I don't think I need to look at it. Depending on how good the shoulders look, if there's damage, if there's only one Lee, I might be more conservative and look at something even if it is outside of 10% Lee widths. So you go through your 20, getting rid of all those items that, just based on class characteristics alone, are not going to be hits. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and go to your side-by-side screen. And now when you're doing max phase 3D, you must remember every time you see 3D to 3D or tracks to tracks items, the default phase setting is maxly 3D. So to correlate for max phase 3D, I need to check the percent sign each time, confirm that I am in the correct phase. In this case, I will be because they're the same phase between maxly and max phase 3D, and then go ahead and correlate it. So you can go ahead, look at the items, move on to the next one. And so each time you are checking the same phase setting, you can go ahead, do your side-by-side comparison, go on to the next item. Check again, the same, look at them side by side, compare them, next item. And so you do the same thing all the way through your top 20. Now here's an example of one where they are different phase settings. So max lead 3D is phase 4, which is our default phase setting, so that's what we see on the left. But we want to switch it manually to phase 3 to see the actual phase setting that brought the high score. So we'll manually adjust it for phase 3. So remember, it's always Lee 1 to Lee 3. It's always referring to Lee 1 of our reference item. We don't actually have a Lee 3 on our test item, so we'll just do the next pair. So Lee 5 to Lee 2, Lee 1 to Lee 3. So this is the correct phase setting. So move it to the correct pairs, keep them in the new phase setting, and do your side-by-side comparison, look at them, and move on. So you do that all the way through. Once you've done all of those items, you can close your side-by-side, close your multi-viewer, and go back to your chart. And here I would clear all the items. Now we move on to the other of whole bullet to whole bullet comparison, but now in 2D. So organize it from high to low for max phase 2D, clicking off your top 20. Again, I'm looking for any items that don't look like casework. I will continue past the 20 for however many of those items there are. So I don't see anything. Again, I'll look at the score for the last item, 753. So there are several 753s, so I will also look at them as well. And that will be our top 20. and I'll go ahead this time straight to side by side. The reason behind that is because for 2D correlation categories, there remains that 10% cutoff, so I don't expect there to be any items that are significantly smaller or bigger in Lie widths, so there isn't a way to discount them right from the start as I did for 3D. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and go straight to side by side because there's nothing in multi-view I need to see. So here we can see that the default they've given me is phase setting 3, L1 and L3. And because these are 2 and 2D visual that they've given me, I know that the default phase setting is max phase 2D, which is what I'm correlating for. Let me confirm that for you. So again, here we see max phase 2D, phase 3, that's what we have. So what you need to remember when you're correlating for max phase 2D is that anytime you see 2 2D images come up side by side, you don't need to go ahead and check the phasing if you have a whole bullet and you know the number of leaves, because it will stick to the default phase setting of max phase 2D, which is what you're correlating for. So go ahead, look at all those pairs, do your side-by-side comparison, move on to the next item. Now here we see 2 tracks items, but remember you're correlating for max phase 2D. And when you're looking at 2 tracks items, the default phase setting will be for max Lie 3D. So that's phase 3, which is what we see, Lie 1 and Lie 3. You need to make the adjustment to phase 2 yourself. So let's make that adjustment there. Now you can do your comparison of the Lies to Lies, and just make sure that when you're moving on to the next Lie pair, as you go through, that you keep these 2 bullets in the phase 2 setting. And that's what you do all the way through. 2D items, you can just go ahead and correlate as is, go through all the pairs. 3D items, you need to make sure that you change the phase setting if necessary, but at least make sure that you check it. That's how you go through max phase 2D. Now when it's time to do max Lie 2D, do not clear the screen. Just go ahead, keep those top 20 checked off, and now organize by max Lie 2D. You'll see that you have some overlap, and anytime you have overlap, that could mean less work for you. So now that you've organized from high to low max Lie 2D scores, anything that's not checked you'll need to check off because you never looked at that item. When you have an item that's checked, that means you might have already looked at it. But remember, they might be the wrong phase. So what you do is you compare the scores between max Lie 2D and peak phase 2D. Here you can see in this example, 304, 304, they're the same score. We're going to assume the best Lie to Lie was also the best Lie to Lie in the max phase, which is peak phase. So I assume then that max Lie has the same phase as peak phase, and peak phase is the same phase as max phase. And since it's already clicked off, that means I previously looked at it. So I don't need to look at it again. I can unclick that item. Next items I haven't looked at, so I will click them off. I have a checked off item. Again, compare the scores. They are the same. I assume max Lie, the best Lie to Lie, is actually the same best Lie to Lie in the max phase, which is peak phase. Same phasing, I already looked at it, I can unclick it, and so on. So every time you compare, when you have a checked off item, this is a checked off item, they have a different score, 232, 214. So that means it's not the same phase as peak phase, or not the same phase as max phase, which means I haven't looked at this in the correct phase, I'll need to look at it again, I'll leave it checked off. And we'll continue doing that, comparing the scores, they're the same. I've already looked at it, I haven't looked at these. Different scores, I haven't looked at it for the correct phase, I will need to look at it again. Leave it checked off. Different again, same thing. These I haven't looked at, so I'm going to check those off. And that should be my top 20. Again, now I'm going back to look at them and see if there's anything that's not casework. Nope, and it looks good. So that is my top 20. Again, now look for the last item, 217 score. And I have another 217, so I will also look at that. And that will be my top 20. But remember, since we did not clear the screen, there's a lot of things that are still checked off that I don't need to look at. So you'll keep scrolling down and uncheck all these items that are not in your top 20. If you forget to do this last step of unchecking past the top 20, you will end up looking at a lot more items. So we'll go ahead and uncheck all these. And there we go. That's your true top 20 for max Lie 2D. So now we'll go straight to the side-by-side. Remembering this is a 2D correlation category. There is a 10% Lee width size cutoff, so there won't be a use for the multi-viewer screen because you cannot say no to looking at items side by side just based on size. And what you gotta do for Max Lee 2D is once you're in the side-by-side view, you have to check each time the percent sign to see the scores, because you won't remember whether or not this is an item you've looked at previously or not, and whether or not they have the same phase as Max Phase 2D. So same score here between Max Lee 2D and Peak Phase 2D, which means you can assume then Max Lee 2D is the same phase as Max Phase 2D, so Phase 2, which is the default because these are 2D items. Go ahead and do your comparison and look at all the pairs in that phase. Then you can look at the next item. Again, you'll check. Same score, same phase, Phase 2, which actually happens to be a phase for all of them. You don't need to make a change. Do your comparisons, look at all the lead pairs, and then go to the next item. And that's how you move all the way through for Max Lee 2D. What happens if you come to those items that actually had a different score between Max Lee 2D and Peak Phase 2D? Like in this example, 233 to 205. Again, what this tells you is the best Lee-to-Lee combination in all the possible Lee-to-Lee combinations is not the best Lee-to-Lee in Max Phase, which is what Peak Phase is. So that means 233 was generated in a phase other than Phase 2. So that means you need to look at all the phases except Phase 2. So let's do that. So default, of course, is Phase 2. So we will go ahead and change the phasing. I like to start off with the first phase, of course, because it helps remember where I am. So do Lee 1 to Lee 1, and that's Phase 1. Then the next pair in that Phase 1, next pair, next pair, next pair, and then you do your comparison. Now you're back to Lee 1. It's not Phase 2, so skip that. Move to Phase 3. Look at those pairs and do all 5 pairs. Doing your comparison. Move on to Lee 4, and that's phase setting 4. Compare the pairs. And finally, Lee 5, phase setting 5, and do all the pairs. And once you've compared all those, then you can be certain that you've looked at, in some instance, the phase that brought that high score. And that's what you do going all the way through Max Lee 2D. Check the score each time, make adjustments as necessary. If the phase is unknown for Max Lee 2D, do the combinations except the phase for Max Phase 2D.
That's basically the end of the presentation. Again, this stuff should be on the DVD. If you have questions or whatever, of course, you can leave your business card with us or we can give you ours. It is a lot of material. If you're not familiar with the screens, the buttons, all that stuff, you need to run it through quite a few times. It took us a while for even the operators at our site to get into the hang of doing it without checking the flowchart each time. What step am I on now? What step am I on now? So it is just a matter of practice, but then once that happens, hopefully you'll take your 2-hour plus correlation time for a bullet back down to 45 minutes is our average again. So we went from 30 to 2 hours and more, and now we're doing this cut down method of correlations, and we're back down to an average about 45 minutes. It can go longer if you have these unknown phase settings for Max Lee, because then you got to do all the combinations, and that in effect means you could be doing like 20 more bullets or something. But if you don't have too many of those, your average turnaround time should go back down. And we think that it's a pretty good method at this point on how to do correlations. And future versions of tracks, you can also maybe cut down doing Max Lee 2D at all, because they've changed the way they calculate Max Phase 2D also into averages, just like Max Phase 3D. So once they have that average calculation in, instead of doing summations, we can cut down one more category, and we'll be happy with doing 2, Max Phase 2D, Max Phase 3D. I think we'll be back to doing half an hour on correlation time. So that's the end of our presentation. If you have questions, we'll be here a little longer. I plan on taking the last bus to the thing at 6:30, so I don't mind staying around. But if you want to catch the 5:45, like Peter says, then you might want to go now. Thank you.